Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the second of our Ask Julia events for Good Grief with Julia Samuel. I'm Liesl Dawson. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Bristol. Today we are talking about grief after the death of a parent. Julia Samuel is one of the UK's leading psychotherapists, as well as founding patron of Child Bereavement UK. She is also the best-selling author of GriefWorks and This Too Shall Pass. Before we get started, I'm going to remind you a little bit about the structure and some of the practicalities of this webinar. So this session will be divided into two halves. Julie and I are going to speak for the first bit, and then there'll be about 30 minutes to ask questions. Quite a lot of questions have already come in, and you can also type your questions into the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window. And also do feel free to type responses to each other's questions. Now, I should probably warn you, we might not, in fact, I'm almost certain that we won't have enough time to answer all the questions. We've had so many, but we will do our best. We're also going to have a feature, which I'll explain later, where if you would like to respond or add in vocally, you can. But when we get to the question session, I'll explain a little bit more about that. Do use the chat box to say hello and also to find links to resources. And also just to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the Grief channel subsequently. So housekeeping done. Welcome, Julia. It's so wonderful to have you here again for this second session. I wonder if we could start off this particular webinar with a question about the particular challenges, the emotional, the psychological challenges. What's unique or what's particular to losing a parent, the death of a parent?
First of all, hello to everybody, and from all over the world, it looks like, and it's it feels such an important community to come together and have these conversations, and they have the opportunity to kind of voice what is often not voiced, that, you know, grief is still so very hidden and there's still so much ignorance. And in my responses, I don't think I'll necessarily answer your questions. I'll certainly talk to you from my experience or what I think. And if you disagree with them, in a way that's useful because it'll help clarify what you do think. So it isn't really about being right or wrong. I think it's having the opportunity to explore, because grief is a complex business and there are very rarely kind of direct answers. But to talk to your question about what are the particular aspects of a parent dying that are difficult, or, you know, what happens, it may not be that they're difficult. I mean, I think in a way, to state the obvious, you know, your mum and dad, whichever one has died, are the first people that have ever laid eyes on you, that have ever held you. They've known you from the moment that you're born. And in a way, however difficult your relationship is with your parents, whether they've found you difficult or you find them difficult or not at all, they know you essentially more than anybody else has ever known you. And that sense of being known by them, I don't think can ever be kind of replaced by anybody else. And I think people find the death of a parent who they've been very close to like a kind of terrible loneliness, like a kind of really kind of brutal bleakness. And often your parents, if you're really lucky, are the people that have loved you most in the world, that have always been there for you in the world in a way that maybe even other people that you've really loved aren't, because there is the kind of blood link, the kind of oxytocin bond between a parent and a child that is completely unique. It isn't any other kind of domain of our relationships. So, I mean, that's, yeah.
Yeah, I think a follow-up question to that really is about the way in which the death of a parent impacts one's sense of self and sense of the future. As you say, this relationship is sort of foundational to how we are formed, but also how we see ourselves. We often look to our parents when we've done something well, for praise, for recognition. So when we lose our life's witness in that way, could you talk a little bit about how that impacts our identity?
I mean, that's a lovely way of saying his life's witness. I think two parts of that come up. First of all, if it's your last parent that has died, so it's the kind of both your parents are dead, that sense of being an orphan can leave you feeling very untethered and alone, but also it puts you in touch with your mortality, that in your family line, you're in the next in line to die. But also a huge amount of your identity, your racial identity, your cultural identity, where you were born, your belief system, your values, come initially from your parents. And a lot of those values and beliefs you can change over time. Even your kind of gender identity, you may change. But your initial sense of your identity comes entirely from what is modeled and what you were brought up in. And identity is a key part of our psychological health. That sense of every aspect of my identity, all the different versions of our identity, need to feel that that they're in sync, that they're loved and they belong. And if they've been very kind of mirrored from our parents' identity, as you said, that witness thing is that we might feel that our sense of identity has completely been kind of shifted off its central axis when you no longer have your mother or your father kind of reflecting back your belief system at you in a kind of affirming, loving, confirming way. And that takes a long time to adjust.
So there's a kind of grief process, but there's also a way in which you're reimagining yourself and your future. And, I guess that's very frightening, but there's also opportunities there as well for a kind of recreation of self at times, but it can be very frightening.
I think the unknown is always frightening. And, as you and I have talked about before, pain is the agent of change. Pain, as much as we never want to feel it and want to do what we can to avoid it, is the way that we adjust to this new reality that our mother or father has died. But in that process of adjusting, you also find a way of internalizing them. So that, when I've worked with people whose parents have died, if they ask them, should I marry this guy? They have internalized their mother or father's voice and beliefs that they can say yes or no, or what, they know them. And so the process of adjustment is the touchstones to memory, but it takes longer than you want. And obviously the relationship, how they died, the circumstances of the death, all of that will influence that process.
Can you say a little bit about how the death of a parent can also impact other relationships? We know in a family, for example, sometimes a mother dies and she's the kind of center that everybody moves around, and suddenly the familiar structures are altered by this death. And it can also impact upon your marital relationships or your friendships. Can you reflect a little bit on that?
Completely. So in a family system, everyone develops roles in a family system, and the parents often lead. So in most functional families, and it can be that children's lead, but that tends to be in more dysfunctional families, but families that have good enough relationships, that communicate well enough, people have their roles. And as you say, when a member of that family system dies, there's huge gaps in who does what. And, like if it's mum always does Sunday lunch and you go to mum for lunch on Sunday, there's this terrible space where you all came together. And so the work is recalibrating the family system, which is kind of acknowledging and feeling the loss of the presence of the person, but also finding ways of how you are with each other as siblings or with the remaining parent, so that often the relationship with the surviving parent is very altered. So if the mother dies first, they may have had a more distant relationship with the father, for instance. And actually often that relationship gets closer when the mother has died, because you spend more time with them and they become talking to you in a way that they may have only talked to their partner before.
Yeah.
But also your marital relationship, grief is, is such a tiny word, but describes a kind of firestorm of feelings. And when you're full of these feelings, it does not make you easy to live with. and the kind of sense of being misunderstood by your partner, or that it's like you have a layer of skin that's missing. And so everything people do annoys you. So normally if, you know, they'd forgotten to buy the milk, you'd be like, you've forgotten to buy the milk. But when you're grieving, it's like, you've forgotten to buy the milk. And so that, you know, that sets up masses of tension where your partner's saying, well, it's just milk. And so that feeling of being misunderstood and disconnected. And also when you're grieving, your feelings are very heightened. So your capacity to connect with someone, so to feel close to someone, we need the bonding oxytocin neurotransmitter, and that we need to feel calmer, so that we receive the person and they can receive us, and that then we can kind of have a bonding connection, whether it's with a hug or talking or whatever it is. When we're very distressed, we're very hyper, we're kind of in fourth gear, and we can't really take in what other people are giving us. It's much harder to receive. It's what we need most. And that also adds that sense of isolation and feeling misunderstood. And then people tend to, you know, behave in ways that make people close to you step away rather than step towards you.
Yes, and it can make you feel terribly unsafe. And when you're unsafe, it's hard to love as well, that the whole world seems an unsafe, unknown place. We talked a little bit about how the love of a parent can be foundational, how it can provide, you know, the witness to our life. But I wonder about those relationships that are much more fraught and difficult, where there's unresolved issues between a parent and child, and how that complicates our experience of grief, and what people do when they've lost a parent, but actually they're very ambivalent in terms of their feelings.
So, I mean, nothing is always, the tendency that happens is that you would assume there'd be a sense of relief when finally this parent who you've never been able to get their attention from, or their approval, or there's been this kind of longing for something, has finally died, and you're left at peace. But actually the reverse happens, because now you're faced with the reality that you will never have the hope that you can resolve that complexity and that difficulty. And so often, if you had an ambivalent relationship with your parent, you have an ambivalent grief. And that is more likely to be a complex, unresolved grief, because, well, for obvious reasons. You know, when you have a very loving, secure relationship, you tend not to have regrets. So although it's painful, it's quite straightforward, it's quite clean. But when it's very complicated, you bring back all the memories of what you wanted to have and what you wished you could have. And you, in some ways, grieve them again in the knowledge that I can never get it now. And that is very painful. And it's a long, you know, it's a long old process.
We do hear, you know, all the time about wanting to talk to the person who has died, you know, that there's always more things to say. And again, that's, you know, even more the case, I guess, when the relationship is complicated. And you've talked before about some of the kind of strategies. If you have things that you want to say to a parent who's died, what can one do? What are the kind of, you know, techniques?
I mean, I think I think a lot of people think that they're mad talking to their parent, but I think everybody, I don't know anyone who doesn't talk to someone who's died. I mean, we just do. We talk to them in our heads, or sometimes we speak it out loud. And it's because they're part of us. And I remember a client saying to me once, heaven is the place I am remembered. So in that way that when you're remembered someone, that's where they are in you, in your heart or in your memory. And I think making kind of concrete letters, postcards, speaking into your phone, like in some way creating a communication to the person that's died, is incredibly helpful, because you know, grief is invisible. It's everything is below the waterline, so nobody knows what's going on. And if you can actually make it concrete by writing a letter, by writing a postcard, and doing it ongoing, and it can become a journal, it can just be letters that you file. It's a very cathartic process. So if someone who's, for instance, had a complicated relationship with their parent, I would suggest kind of going through their memories, writing them down and just getting them out, because in the narrative we're story meaning making beings, and in the narrative of telling themselves the story of what's happened to them, it can help them understand and have much more clarity, because it's the child that's hurt. And so the adult can look back at the child and go, oh my God, so rather than having that unvoiced child that needs connection, you kind of pay attention to the child, and the child finds a way of having a voice. And that can be incredibly curative.
Yeah, and as you say, we do often know the answers. We have a kind of intuition of what people will say back. So you can even write a letter to someone and then write the response and, and imagine what they would say back. And I mean, we are constituted out of the people we love and the people we've lost. I mean, it's emotional, but it's genetic. I look at my daughter and she looks like my mother. And, so we do have this, this aspect. I wonder if there are particular circumstances. So we've talked about the complicated relationship, but are there other circumstances in terms of the form of the death, or, that make one more at risk for prolonged or complicated grief?
I mean, there is definitely a good death, although people wouldn't say that those two words should ever be next to each other, but I think they should. There's a good death and there's a bad death. And all of these things are on a spectrum. But a death that is sudden, unexpected, so if it's a death by an accident, death by suicide, is incredibly complex. A death by COVID now, where you may not be able to see the person, you may not be able to come into the hospital, you don't have the opportunity to say goodbye. They may have been very well the week before and then get COVID and die very suddenly. So a sudden and unexpected death where you had no preparation, and the shock of it, one of the ways we term it is like it's grief with the volume turned up. So that grief is always difficult, but it is a natural process. It is our natural physiological, psychological adjustment to a normal event that people die. We're born and we die. That is a fact. But sudden unexpected death adds layers of complexity to it that make it harder.
And I guess especially if that death seems out of the natural order, or yes, as you say,
and I guess dies young. So
yeah. If there are people in our audience who have parents at the moment who are ill, or they have a terminal diagnosis, what advice would you give them in terms of what to do now with the time that they have left?
My advice to anyone with parents, but in particular to parents who have a life-limiting or life-threatening illness, is to have the conversations now that will support you after they've died. So that kind of talk to them in generalized terms about, when you think about dying, what do you believe? Do you think you're going to go to heaven? What kind of funeral do you want? Do you want a cremation or a funeral? What are the things that matter to you? What's your ethical will? What's the kind of belief system you want me to kind of think of? We always kind of talk about transferring our pictures and our furniture, and siblings can have fights that they never speak again over a kind of small picture. But actually, in some ways, the ethical will is more important. Like, get them to write it down, to have conversations with them. And the big thing is not to have regrets. Like, to say the things like, I love you, to say the things that, like, I remember when, and it was so lovely when, and maybe record conversations. So I think it's lovely to have audio or video of our parents, and it can be years before they die, or it can be weeks before they die. I was working with someone whose mother was dying, and she has now lovely memories of lying on the bed beside her, where she read her stories, she read her poems, and she sketched. So she has little pencil drawings of her mum's hands, of the room. And those are lovely, powerful, embodied touchstones to memory that are very comforting and incredibly helpful. I mean, the other thing is, get the basic information, get their passwords, their phone stuff. All of those things create what's incredibly difficult, much more difficult, because you feel like you've lost someone, and then if you can't get into their laptop, you can't get into their phone. So have a place where you put it all. I think I said that last time, but I'll probably say it every time. I've had so many distressed clients who...
Yeah. And I mean, COVID, I've seen in the chat, a lot of people have mentioned how COVID has made so much of this difficult in terms of spending time with parents, or attending a funeral.
Creating memories.
And exactly, is there any other thoughts about what we can do in this COVID period? So I guess some of it still holds. You can still have the conversations, even though it's not in person. But are there other, and I guess getting getting recordings or videos of pictures, are there other kind of COVID specific thoughts?
I think you can write them letters, send them postcards. I think particularly that generation, and it's lovely to receive a letter because you can go over it. So you can really, or every few days postcards. It's such a lovely way of connecting. I would record the video chats that you have. I mean, your parents won't mind. Make sure you put them in the diary. And my big question, so when I work with families where someone is dying, the question I ask is, what are your worries? That's a really good generic question. And if you're someone like my mum, she said nothing, even though she'd been given a terminal diagnosis of cancer, because she didn't like facing reality, my mum, and she never had, and she was not going to now. But somebody else might say, I'm worried about what's going to happen with my cat. Or they might say, I'm frightened of dying. So it's a great way in, and you can ask it tons of times.
And it takes you into really important questions, which is nice. And I suppose the one thing about COVID is it perhaps gives us the sort of excuse or opportunity to have these conversations. It is hard to broach these topics, but COVID puts this, front and center for us all to think about.
But the reason it's hard is because we have this kind of magical thinking that if I talk about death, I will somehow hasten my death or hasten the death of someone I love. But the biggest kind of derailer of grief is regrets. All the things you don't know, all the things you didn't say, all the conversations that you wished you'd have come and haunt you. So it is much better to kind of take a breath, hold that this is frightening. And your parents may have been longing to talk to you, but they were protecting. One of the most difficult things when people are ill is this co-protection that can happen where the parent wants to protect the child and the child is protecting the parent. But then that is experienced as a kind of gap between each other, and you both feel kind of armored with each other. And it's much harder to feel really close and feel really kind of feel each other's empathy when you're shutting down on a lot of what is actually worrying you.
I also think one way is to talk about one's own death.
Yes.
That I think that with COVID as well, who knows who's going to, get it, who's going to be susceptible. So it's a sort of prompt for us to think about our own death. And in talking about our own death, we can sort of then make it a mutual conversation, which I think then takes this sort of the awkwardness somehow out of it.
Yourself is a lovely. I was thinking about if I died suddenly,
Yeah, exactly. We are, I think, at a good point, perhaps, that we could move on to the questions, especially because we have so many.
Can I just say, I love the way everyone's talking to each other. It feels so collective, and that it's like buy one, get one free, like you and I are talking, but also everyone is talking to each other. I kind of want to join in.
I know, it is lovely. And it creates that, that sense of community. And also, I think one thing is, you talked about how isolated people feel when they're grieving. And we all want to know that we're part of this, absolutely fundamental human experience, and we can share it with one another. So I absolutely, I think that's a lovely aspect of it. And we have lots of questions, so I'm going to start. Okay. So the first question is from Claire, and it's a question regarding the effect on current relationships of a bereavement. Claire writes, I'm surprised at how much the sudden loss of my mum has affected my current relationship. My partner has not been through my experience, and so it has opened up a gulf between us. He has no idea how it feels, so it cannot be a shared grief. This affects how I speak to him and treat him, even though I know it's not his fault. Can you say something about, which you have done, about how the death of a parent impacts other relationships, and how I can keep myself from feeling resentful or pushing my partner away.
So the bit, that we said before about when you're hurting, it brings up lots of very strong feelings in the person that's bereaved, and that adds to your sense of isolation. I mean, my response, Claire, is that you two need, I think walking and talking is very helpful, but you need to kind of talk with each other and find a way of feeling understood. So it feels, from your question, it feels like you're standing back, you're envious of him for having both his parents. He doesn't understand it. You don't want to feel cross with him, but you are cross with him because he's got what you haven't got. And then you're really, really devastated at the death of your parent. But actually what you need to do is be able to acknowledge and name that in the partnership and find a way of communicating the differences between you and allowing the differences, and also helping him understand how he can meet you. So he can't mind read. He doesn't know what you need or what you want unless you tell him. And so my kind of first kind of basic would be, what is it that you're looking for from him? What do you want him to understand? What would you like him to know? And really your basic question is, what do you need? Ask yourself, what do I need right now? And find a way of telling him what you need, and find a way of working out together how you can get that need met. That would be my first step. And obviously there will be many more going forward, but.
Okay, thank you.
He's probably scared of saying something wrong, so he's not saying anything, and that then you feel kind of left. So also ask him what his worries are in relation to you. What is he finding difficult? Help yourself understand him.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I'm gonna go next to a question that's come up from the Q&A. It's from Rosalind. My mum died in October from cancer, and my dad was just diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in January.
Wow.
How do I grieve for my mum when I need to support my dad in his illness, taking on the role my mum would have, and grieve for his loss too?
I mean, well, first of all, I'm so sorry. I think to some extent, you're feeling overwhelmed because this is overwhelming, that your mum has died and it's your dad that's been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, isn't it? So your dad's still alive. And I think to some extent, and he's grieving her too, to some extent, your grief for your mum, I think, will be suspended while you're looking after him, because you can't do lots of things at once. My suggestion would be that if you can carve out a little pocket of time, maybe once or twice a week, where you take yourself off and go for a walk and think about your mum, or talk to your mum, or go to a place where you live and write to your mum, journal, create a memory box, so take a little bit to give a little bit of time and a little bit of focus on your mum. That can support you enough. And also get support from people around you. This is multiple losses. Grief starts at the point of diagnosis. So it's a living loss right now, but it's a loss, pancreatic cancer. He's clearly going to die.
I sort of wonder how the father is also feeling, because he presumably is grieving too. And I wonder if opening up a conversation with him about the mum might be really healing for, he might not want to, but it also seems like an opportunity to share the grief together.
That's a lovely idea. Good point. Yeah.
I have two COVID related questions that have come in. And I'm going to just read them both, I think. One from Anonymous. I wasn't able to see my dad's body after he died because of COVID. He died suddenly and unexpectedly, and I wasn't there. How can I make his death feel more real? And a kind of related question from A. Berry. My dad died a month ago from COVID-19. How do we come to terms with a death that feels, senseless, surreal, unfair? we were unable to be with him for his final 5 weeks. The finality of it all is really hard to process. So again, it's about, not being able to take in the reality of the death for both of these.
I mean, the first task of grieving is finding a way of living with the reality of the death. And if you have no data, like you have no image of seeing your parent that has died, dead, and you had no opportunity to say goodbye to them, it is then surreal. And so what I'm saying is that it's normal that you feel like your grief is suspended or that it feels surreal. What I would think about doing is creating rituals, but also touchstones that link you to the person that's died. So maybe if you have any kind of faith, going to your place of faith and lighting a candle, or doing it within your home, to kind of honor them and say something, maybe a prayer or a poem, have a photograph, so that you give them time in your day where you remember, and you remember that they've died. The other thing I'm kind of thinking about, and I don't know what you think, Liesl, of like holding on to something. If I don't know if you can go to where they lived and get a scarf or a piece of clothing that you can hold and wear, that makes them feel the way you can smell. Smell is such an embodied sense that kind of makes us have feelings that get expressed. And maybe by doing that, we'll put you in touch with what you're feeling, because I imagine you're feeling numb, and maybe by having a sense of smell of a piece of their clothing will short circuit the numbness to really feel their loss.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I think that's important. I think even people who haven't had the COVID death often have that sense of unreality. How can a living person who occupies my life suddenly vanish? It makes absolutely no sense. So I think COVID really heightens those very normal reactions to death, and rituals, activities that in a way keep having you tell yourself this person has died, but also miss them and feel the emotion is a way to move that along. I think, and I think I absolutely agree with you about smell. I think smell is really powerful, and things that we can keep close to us.
And maybe a playlist that again would short circuit, a playlist of your parents' favorite music. That again, the memory of that may allow you, because you need to kind of feel stuff. And when you're numb with shock of it, and it's surreal, you don't feel anything, and that's almost worse, because you just feel so out of your body. You feel like you're not present anywhere. So things that connect you to them and allow you to feel, and maybe you'll have creative ways yourself.
Yeah. I have a question now from Martin about complicated grief. I had an abusive childhood, as a result of which I have recently been diagnosed with PTSD. My mother died in 2007. When my father died in 2017, I discovered he had a second family in Africa while still married to my mother.
Right.
The relationship in Africa had been going on for 30 years. Now that they're both no longer around, how do I begin to process this along with the grief?
Martin, I'm so sorry. That is so many multiple complex losses, and I'm not at all surprised that you've got PTSD. I mean, my first thought is that you need proper psychological support, that you should get a therapist through your GP or through a counselling organisation, that this is something, it's so multi-layered. The abuse in your childhood, the death of your mum, the lies and the kind of not knowing who your father was and not knowing this family, it's so complex. So I think you definitely need to get support. And like with everybody, I'd say to everybody, do the basic things that are self-care. And I would suggest this to everyone that's listening, like take exercise, go outside, do intentional things that soothe you, do any kind of meditation or breathing, eat well, and connect to friends, like connect to I don't know if it's you have complex relationships because of your complex childhood, but feel, it's the love of others that help us survive when someone we love has died. So try and get a group of support around you. And that will help kind of steady you, I hope. My only other thought is that when we have very complex grief and deaths, multiple losses, one of the questions that you can kind of ask yourself, because it's like looking in a room that's full of kind of poison and jumble, is what can I deal with today? Is there one thing that I can manage today? So keep that one thing in a kind of bite-sized step and put a time aside to do that. And then match that one thing that you can do today with something that intentionally supports you. That is either talking to a friend, making yourself your favorite coffee, putting flowers in your kitchen, having a smelly bath, whatever it is that supports you. Match the grieving thing with a piece of self-support.
That's lovely advice. We have a question that's come in tonight from a widow supporting their child. Any advice on supporting my 10-year-old daughter after the death of her mother, my wife, after a long illness, 9 years?
I'm so sorry. So the 9 years was as a living loss, wasn't it? All the time that she was ill. So I'm going to make some assumptions. I'm going to make the assumption that your daughter knows the truth, that she knew that her mum was dying as she was dying, that she kind of went to the funeral and has so the first place to start is that children need as much information as the adults around them, and they need lots of love and support, and that you as the surviving parent modeled for them how to grieve, and that so you can show them that you both feel sad and that you can get on and cook a supper, that you wake up and you can feel like, say to her, like, I feel, oh, today is a hard day. But then you can watch something on telly and laugh together. So grieving is this oscillation between restoration and loss orientation, where you move between the two. And if you model that to your daughter and give her lots of love and affection, she needs to find ways of expressing her grief. And, as Liesl knows, because we've done this together, a child's grief is like jumping in and out of puddles. You can jump in and be very sad and jump out and be incredibly happy within minutes. Or you can go for, a child can go for days not being sad and then have then be very sad. But allow her to have her feelings. Often children say, don't be sad, you're okay, be okay. Actually let her express her sadness, and then let her get on and be a happy child. I hope that's answered some of your questions.
I think that's good. And making sure kids know it's okay to be sad and angry, and it's okay to be happy. Yeah. I think people grieving are in the weird catch-22. They feel bad when they're feeling bad. They feel bad when they're feeling good. And actually both are required for processing the experience.
And normal.
And anger and fear and all the other emotions. Exactly.
They feel abnormal. So grief, often people feel like they're going mad. And just to remind yourself, you're not going mad, that this is grief and this is what it feels like.
Yeah. We have 2 questions regarding losing a parent to suicide. The first one is from Anna, who says, what are your thoughts on the loss of a parent to suicide? How can we best support children after a parent takes his or her own life? We have a related question from Jan and Phil. Our grandson is 9 years old and lost his mother at 6 months old. He has no memory of her, but is grieving. What can we do to help him? His mum died of suicide and he doesn't know how she died. When should he be told?
So, in some ways, you need to talk to a therapist to talk that through together, because my thoughts will be a bit of a blunt instrument. But I'll tell you my generalized thoughts and then maybe take them to a therapist and get support. Is, of course, that suicide is at the complex end of grief, and it is the grief of it is the volume turned up with the kind of infinite number of questions that start with why or what if or what did I miss or what didn't I do, and that those questions can never fully be answered. Children of parents who've died by suicide are particularly vulnerable. So my reply to the last one, my belief, and you know your grandchild best, is that children need the same truth as all the adults around them, that she will likely find out what happened, and then she won't trust you as much because she hasn't been given the truth. So if she's to trust you, she needs to know the same truth as everybody. That is my perception, but it's very individual. One of the ways when I talk to clients who've been bereaved by suicide is that it's a way of understanding it is that it's like a heart attack of the brain, that somebody can have a sudden heart attack when they're young, and that the firing of the heart kind of breaks, and that a suicide can be like a fast storm where the electrics in your head don't work anymore. So it's like a heart attack of the brain. Because I think when people try and explain suicide, they try and kind of make it as a choice. And I never think of suicide as a choice. I think people get to a point of level of pain, even if they've tried it before, that they lose connection with everybody around them, and that suicide, death, seems the only choice to stop the pain, that they feel it's better for everybody else. The other aspect of suicide, I would join groups. There's Papyrus, there's Sobs, there's Mind. Being with other people who have a similar experience can be very supportive for children. For the child, there's Child Bereavement UK. They have groups. But find a community of people that can support you. I think that can help with the isolation. What do you think, Lisa?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And I think they need further support. They need at some point to be told the truth, but it needs to be done carefully, kindly.
Bite-sized chunks.
Yeah, and I'm also remembering one of your case studies, which we've discussed before in your book, where there was a young man who'd lost his mum at a very early age, and actually hearing stories about
I forgot that bit.
Her love for him were very healing, that kind of keeping
the memory
sort of creating a version of her for him, that although she had this terrible thing happen and she did this, there might be lovely stories about her caring for him, loving him, being with him. And I think that can also be sort of restorative for that.
And creating a place that they can go to find, like photographs of their mum, pieces of her jewelry. I hope things haven't been thrown away. That when they're older, they can talk to mum's best friends, to godparents, to aunts, because they need. So, like with Max, and I would think with any young person who didn't know their mum, who died when they were too young, there's a sort of mother-shaped hole that's in Max, was a mother-shaped hole, and he couldn't fill the hole. He had to acknowledge the loss and grieve the loss. But he had to find a version of her that he could imagine. I really want everyone to recognize the power of imagination to be curative, both for when we're adult and when we're children, that we shape a lot of how we feel by what we imagine and what we picture. And that when he can really, so with Max, he got lots of stories and photographs and saw her handwriting and had conversations with people, and then he found a way of having her that he could hold on to her internally, and that became a very stable, supportive place for him, because she died already. She wasn't going to leave him again, so he could trust that she was in him, and that was incredibly curative and powerful.
Yeah, and with suicide, I think there's always the worry that it's my fault, or I wasn't loved enough. So filling in the love can be really powerful. We have another complicated story, which I think is very powerful, from Nicola, it's kind of about getting back to normal, but I think there's a lot more to it. My father passed away 15 years ago this April, and I still feel very much stuck in grief. He suffered from a muscle wasting disorder and eventually had a type of locked-in syndrome. He was bedbound, couldn't move himself, couldn't eat, drink, talk, etc. He was profoundly deaf in one ear and had poor hearing in the other. His family were everything to him. I can't get past wanting to know his thoughts. What was he feeling? Was he scared? Could he see us? Could he hear me tell him I loved him? Was he in pain? I can't talk about my dad as it's too painful, especially with my family. But every day I think of these things and I'm reminded of them as my 3 siblings and 3 nephews all have the same condition. And my brother is deteriorating in the same way. So her question is about moving forward in the grief and, minimizing the pain. But it also seems to me there's something about these recurring, anxious, ruminating thoughts about the imaginings of her father that seem to be very painful.
I mean, where I'm going with it is the rumination, and this is clearly unresolved grief, because when your dad couldn't speak or voice or hear, it's like when he was alive, you embedded what you imagined in your head. And then now that he's died, that's still, it's like a kind of disc that plays constantly in your head, now that he's still alive. And the work is to face the reality that that you have to grieve both the losses that he couldn't hear or speak and the way that he died. And you have to grieve the reality and the fact that he has died, because it feels like you're suspended in a place where you haven't really found a way of living with the reality of his death. And so for that, again, you really do need very good psychological support.
Yeah.
It sounds to me like you've got some trauma as well. And so I would think about seeing someone for PTSD, because also you've got living losses that are happening in your life now too. So I don't know if you've had support before. It seems such a long time. And so I hope that, I don't know, that's what I wonder about. Have you not had support? Have you just kind of felt you've had to white knuckle it all these years without any proper support?
Yeah. And I wonder if there's just a way, thinking about imagination, that this person can think about the love and care
That she
and
gave
imagine actually a different version, which is someone is in pain, someone is suffering, and yet they feel gratitude to the loving support, because that's what one imagines one would feel, that, and also it's separating the things that you can change from the things you can't. She couldn't fix the illness, but she could give the love and support, which she did. And that's very meaningful, I would think, and changes the focus.
Yeah, I think that's a really good thought. You should definitely be a therapist, Lisa.
Very kind. Well, I like doing these with you very much. Thank you. Okay, I have a question about siblings supporting each other. I lost my mother 6 years ago. My younger brother and I only have each other. How do I support my brother and myself? Sometimes it's very lonely, as I don't have anyone older to turn to.
So, I mean, it sounds like you don't have a rivalrous relationship with your brother, so that sounds good. You say younger brother, but you're both adult, I'm guessing. So I would kind of level up the sibling relationship, that you don't have to look after him, but that it can be a mutual relationship where you're both grieving the death of your mum. And spend time talking about your mum, how you both feel, what you miss, what you appreciated about her, what you long for, what she gave. Find memories that are funny, connect together. It isn't your job as a big sister to fix him, but as a sibling relationship, you two were known by her in a way that nobody else was. And so you share this. And that is a very important, lovely kind of touchstone, that you two have this together. And you will each have memories of her that is different. Every child in a family will tell a different story of the life in that family. And so telling each other your different stories would be really interesting and useful. And men and women grieve differently. So he's a boy, and you can help each other. So he might help you kind of think about, this is always a tendency, but men tend to want to get on and move forward. They tend to be restorative. Women tend to be loss-oriented, that they tend to ruminate and have a kind of Sherlock Holmes obsession about every piece of it, wanting every piece of the jigsaw. And as a man and a woman both grieving, you can help each other do a bit of the other. So he might help think about your future and what you need, and you can help him find a way of processing his pain and feeling it.
That's lovely. We have Torty Ray here, who says, I'm here with my two sisters. So this is about becoming a parent after parent loss. Our mum died when we were 14, 19, and 22.
Wow.
We've all become mothers without her in our lives and are piecing together the parts of our becoming mothers in the context of us not having her in our world during this part of our lives. What would you say to those people who have become or are becoming parents after the loss of their parent, especially a mum?
Such a loss, that, isn't it? Not having your mum witness you becoming a mum, and the kind of longing that must bring. But it feels very powerful that the three of you are kind of together now. So you obviously have close sibling relationships. I wonder if it'd be something like doing both, like acknowledging the loss and naming to each other what you really miss about your mum, what she would have done, what she can't do, what she might have said, what she funny that she might have done, kind of name what you're missing. But in the restorative side, kind of like we've talked already today, kind of be aware of that she's in you, and that the aspects of her parenting and mothering that she gave you, you can share as a mum, that you will, the best parts of her, you can now parent with your children. And with your siblings, kind of name that, was she very patient? Was she funny? Did she teach you how to cook? That some of the aspects of her being a mum, you can use as a mum. And that is a way of her continuing to live, that she, heaven is the place where she's remembered. So she will live on in your children in the way that you parent them, in the ways that were valuable to you. But I think it's important to do both, name the losses, like turn to the dark and what you really miss and what you long for, and then turn to her love and how you can live her love in the way you live your life.
And some of those ways of externalizing the relationship, you can bring that in with the kids. If there is a particular thing the mum did that you remember, incorporating that into your family traditions and talking about her is a way of including her, and having her be present.
Or her tomato soup, or having pictures of her and talking about and telling stories. My mum had particular expressions, and so I tell that to my grandchildren, and so she's alive in the way that I tell my bonkers mother's stories, basically.
We have a question about grief's effect on sleep from Anonymous. My mum passed away just under 3 months ago of terminal cancer, and her decline happened very quickly. I have been dreaming about her a lot lately. In the dream, she's unwell, but still getting on with life. I suddenly wake up in the middle of the night and struggle to get back to sleep. This tends to lead me to feeling incredibly sad for the rest of the day. Do you have an understanding of why this might be happening?
I mean, why I think is that your unconscious is forcing you to face the reality of your mum's death. And maybe in the day, although you're feeling sad, you're in some way not facing it. You may be as well. A lot of people like having dreams of the person that's died. They may wake up very sad, but they feel it's a way of having them. I would write the dreams down and kind of, chart them as it were. It seems to me it's part of your grieving process that sounds quite healthy. I mean, it feels miserable and waking up sad and tired, but she's not waking up in the middle of the night, is she?
She's just waking up, she is, and sometimes can't get back to sleep, and then that is difficult. But you're absolutely right that the dreams are common, and actually, because I read a lot of grief memoirs, and often they're quite violent. The grief for someone you love, sometimes that translates into killing the person. And it's a beloved person, but that I read about quite a lot. So I think it is common, and I think it is the brain processing and trying to understand this unbelievable
REM sleep
fact. Yeah.
The advice that I think works if you wake up is don't stay in bed. Like, get up, go out of your bedroom, make yourself a hot drink, maybe read a poem or write notes, not like coherent, but write things down. Do some kind of relaxation thing, like a 5-minute breathing exercise, and then go back to bed. Because and I hope that your bedroom is cold, that you have a kind of sleep hygiene, that you turn your machines off, for a couple of hours before you go to sleep, that you have a routine. Our bodies like routines, and when we're traumatized, when we're kind of very distressed, the more things that you do that are regular and stabilize the body help you sleep.
Yeah,
So
and enough exercise.
Habits.
Yeah, and enough exercise. If you're not sleeping.
Getting outside, even in the rain, wind, snow, get outside. Daylight really helps with the melatonin in the evening. Don't get on your machines 2 hours before. Don't watch scary stuff on telly.
And don't watch the news before you go to bed. It's one of the scary things.
Yeah.
We are almost out of time. I'm going to finish with one last question. I'm afraid there are so many questions we haven't covered, but we have gotten through quite a lot. So I apologize to all of you, for whom I didn't get to your question. This is another one from Anonymous. It's about preparing for a parent's death. How can we prepare for the death of a parent? I ask as I'm very close to my mother. I cannot imagine life on this planet without her. She's 83, I'm 46. I'm so grateful to have had her throughout my life. However, I fret so much already about life without her, even though she's still here. I feel silly asking this question, but this anxiety is really impacting me right now.
I mean, it seems to me that your anxiety is really grief. You're grieving. It's a living loss. Your grief starts at the diagnosis that your mum is going to die. I would do the things we've talked about already, like have conversations with your mum, record her voice, take photographs of her. All those memories that you store now will be unbelievably precious after she's died. And in some way, I think everyone would agree that you can never be fully prepared for someone dying. So you can have the conversations, you can do all the things that you need to do, but that moment of death, there is no preparation for. And the shock of it and what happens is always very kind of unique. The big thing is to get as much support as you can, get people around you to support you, because this is a really difficult time. I know they can't support you in person, but through being online and things. And that's my first step.
Yeah, I think that's lovely. And in some ways, everything you can do to savor, to record, to say I love you over and over again, it won't
build memory, build data.
It won't stop the pain, but it's also a way of appreciating people when they're here and loving them, in the now. We've had such an amazing chat going on beneath us. It's absolutely
it looks
wonderful. And people being really kind to one another, sharing resources. It's been, we can't engage with it, but it's been beautiful to watch. We have gotten to the hour. And so, which just leaves me really to thank Julia for such wise, profound words, as always. And to thank all of you for coming and sharing with us. And I think that's really it.
And for me to thank you, Liesl, and to thank everybody that joined. And the best thing you can do when you're grieving is to be self-compassionate, is turn to yourself with compassion, be kind to yourself, and support yourself. And from then other things will naturally flow. So I'm glad you found us. You can find me on Instagram, and Liesl, I don't know where you can be found.
A bit of Twitter, bit of here, bit of there.
And the Good Grief Festival, obviously, us now. But there's another event happening at the end of March. So we'll be doing lots of things. So join us for them too. That it's a lovely community that's building. And being part of a community, I think, is very healing.
Definitely. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Julia. And goodbye for now.
Goodbye for now.